Hello and welcome to the AutoTalk podcast / video interview panel, whatever we're calling it these days. What we do have is a great panel and a great topic to discuss today in regards to the new clean car legislation. But first, I'd just like to mention our sponsor, RVE. Now, RVE have developed an amazing new tool that makes selling vehicle accessories, particularly on utes, easy. The RVE configurator allows you and your customer to select and see right on the vehicle a range of great interior and exterior enhancement, from wheels to sports bars to RVE's range of custom leather interiors. Anything is possible. The configurator can be customized to your business and include pricing and your own designs. It's a great way to sell profitable extras. Give it a try at configurator.rve.co.nz. So today we have a great panel from across the industry here to discuss a really important topic, and I'm just going to bring them into the room. We have David Crawford from the Motor Industry Association, David Vinsen from VIA, Kit Wilkerson from VIA, and Tony Everett from the Motor Trade Association. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Hello.
Now, the topic we had to discuss today is a really big one for both distributors, dealers, and ancillary industries throughout the motor trade, and that is the Land Transport Clean Car Amendment Bill, which has just in the last week entered Parliament and has caused quite a stir. Now, of course, this is the legislation that provides for the clean car discount and the clean car standard that have been a topic of discussion for the last year. Now, one of the big news items of today is with the Motor Industry Association, which has announced they have pulled their support for this piece of legislation. David, can you tell us a little about that and why you guys have made that decision?
Thank you, Richard. Yes, we've supported policies that we think would lead to a timely reduction in CO2 emissions from land transport vehicles. And that means that they need to be achievable. It rewards those that can do it and chastises those that don't. We've always supported a full feedback scheme, and we still support that. So we haven't withdrawn our support for that. What we've withdrawn our support for, as the bill is drafted, is the clean car standard, the fuel economy standard. And that is for two principal reasons, but there are a whole lot of other things when you add them up that pile on the difficulties with the bill as drafted. And those two principal reasons are the targets and the ability by regulation to mandate percentage of the vehicles that have to be battery electric only, which I describe as being an ICE ban by stealth. The targets are particularly difficult. So between now and 2025, it's a 40% reduction, and then from 25, based on where we need to be in 2025 to end of 27, another 2 years, it's a further 43% reduction. If I was to look at that and describe it, saying, if we were to just have our response by the number of electric vehicles to achieve that target, then about 23 to 25% of the fleet would need to be EVs by 2025. And that goes up to being about 35% by 2026 and nearly 50% by 2027. The 2027 target is ahead of where Europe will be at that time. It's just not doable in the New Zealand context. And then there are a number of other areas within the bill where it's predicated on a series of misunderstanding about how our markets work. I think that our market vehicles are Europe and Japan, when in reality that's only where they are either made or the head offices are. Where most of our vehicles are sourced from is the Australasian market, dominated by Australia. They are 90% of the market, so the vehicles are built to their standards, not to ours. And so the bill, if enacted, along with the requirements for WLTP testing from next year, then we just simply won't be able to bring in cars because we won't be able to comply them. So for that reason, we've just said to the government, we've supported you in the past, but the bill is drafted, we can't support, and you need to know that we can't support it at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. So essentially what the bill is saying is align with Europe, actually align beyond Europe, when we really align with Australia and Japan.
It's a lack of understanding about how we source our vehicles. Our brands come from, as you know, Europe, Japan, Korea, Asia, North America, and they're manufactured in plants all around the world. But for new vehicles, when we source them, We source them from markets that have the unique standards requirements. And for New Zealand, all of the manufacturers treat us as part of either Oceania or Australasia. And in the Australasian context, Australia is 90% of that market. So over 80% of our vehicles are complied to the Australian design rule standards. They don't require WLTP, and they don't have a clean car standard. So the ability for us to be able to source vehicles and break ranks in Australia, we can do it, but we need 5 years to do that, at least. But we also can't get ahead of what Europe's doing. I mean, we're 0.18% of worldwide production of new vehicles. No one makes vehicles for our market. We don't have a New Zealand market. We only have an Australian market in reality, apart from a few unique small volume models.
David, Vincent, you guys hadn't necessarily officially given any support to the bill, but do you still have concerns about, or the process for that matter, do you still have concerns with the bill as it's been put out to the market?
Yes. We've never supported the bill, and in fact, when we had preliminary discussions with the previous Associate Minister of Transport, Julianne Genter, in February, shortly after she was appointed to the position of Associate Minister of Transport, she talked about this fee-based scheme, which has now become known as the Clean Car Discount. And then we said, well, Minister, if you introduce a scheme like that, we, the industry collectively, will supply the cars that public demand requires. And she then went on to say, no, I want to do further than that. I want to influence the vehicles that you offer them. Because she said, I don't want people going onto yards and buying the wrong cars by mistake. Those were her words. So what she wanted to do was influence the vehicles which are imported and then incentivize the vehicles which are purchased by the public. So this is really an unnecessary layer of regulation. It's an unnecessary layer of central control. And as the new vehicle industry has said, we don't manufacture cars here. We're standards takers, not standards makers. We have the used vehicle industry has a different set of issues from the new vehicle industry. Our supply chain is quite different. We draw from vehicles which have already been manufactured and are in the pool in various other countries, principally Japan. So we're constrained to be able to import vehicles which are already there. So our argument is that the Clean Car Standard is an unnecessary double whammy. It's a double dipping tax take, and it's going to affect the vehicles at the time of importation when they come in. And then there's going to be a double whammy. There'll be taxation at the time they're sold, the Clean Car Discount, the fee-based scheme. So we've been sitting on the fence. We certainly haven't supported the Clean Car Standard, but we've taken the view that it's as a responsible industry association, it's our role to try to mitigate the damage to the industry, to the market, and to consumers, to continue to supply a choice of vehicles. And then following on from that, if it's inevitable that such legislation is going to be introduced, well, then it's our role to try to assist in smooth implementation of that.
Mm-hmm. Just to double back to David Crawford there, and just so we can be very clear, it's not necessarily the bill that you guys have withdrawn support for, it's the Clean Car Standard and Discount process that you've withdrawn support for, is that correct?
It's the Clean Car Standard bit that we can't support. All of the parts of the bill that relate to how the Clean Car Discount or the fee-based scheme works, we still support that part of the bill. It's the Clean Car Standard bit we don't.
Mm-hmm. And if I give it to Tony Everett from the MTA, Tony, what have you guys picked out of the bill and at this stage of the process that concerns you that we haven't already discussed, perhaps?
Yeah, I guess where we sit is the devil was always going to be in the detail, and the detail's now landed, and we're all collectively floundering through some of this, trying to get our heads around it, and we think there's some really problematic areas in the bill. I think David Crawford touched on the new element, which had never been in there before, where a percentage of imports have to be zero carbon. That was never discussed as a theme, and so that's completely new to the industry, and I guess has potentially blindsided it. But even functionality of how that would work, because it's only EVs. So anybody who imports plug-in hybrids, or even ICE in any form, etc., they'll all be subject to potentially another charge. This is a charge on top of a charge, or a fee on top of a fee. And it's difficult to see some logic in there, because in the case of a plug-in hybrid, it earns a rebate, as will hybrid. As we roll into the new year, they'll earn the rebates, but they'll all still contribute to earning a fee for the importer. So there's some sort of logic points that don't really fit very well in this whole thing. We have quite a number of criticisms about the bill as it stands, but I think at the end of the day, our concern at the moment is trying to map out and understand how it's going to impact dealers. And that's where we're really running into a roadblock. And we think that government really needs to put out a flow chart on how this whole process is going to work, because we're sitting here trying to make it up and trying to think through what they're thinking through. And we're running into a lot of roadblocks, and it's looking pretty ugly. So something is desperately needed in that space.
Mm-hmm. Now, David, one of the concerns you guys have, David Crawford, one of the concerns the MIA has raised is in regards to the WLTP standard, and how that doesn't actually apply under our emissions laws yet. May have a place on this. Why do you think they've gone in with this WLTP standard, and can it even function across the market as it stands with our emissions rule?
We don't disagree that the way in which CO2 is measured is converted into a WLTP outcome, because the worldwide harmonisation is much more closer to consumption rates than the old NEDC cycle. So it gives a truer picture. So that's not what we are opposed about. It's the timeline required to be able to reach that. So when the cabinet paper was written back in November, and went to cabinet in December, at that time, in the depths of and in the detail of the cabinet paper, they said they wanted vehicles, whether new or used, manufactured from January 2022 to be tested to the WLTP cycle. And then it went on to say, and then they would have discussions with industry about the timing of acceding to Euro 6. Now, what they didn't, and that showed straight away, they didn't appreciate the technicalities between a vehicle exhaust emission standard and then the testing protocol within that standard. So the default for the testing protocols for Euro 5 and up to Euro 6B is NEDC. That doesn't mean to say you can't do WLTP, but if a market requires it, then you've got to pay for that test for the model yourself. And that's hundreds of thousands of dollars. And our market's not big enough to do that. The default for Euro 6D is the WLTP testing regime. So then if they want to make us use the WLTP testing cycle, then they need to move to Euro 6D. And therein lies the rub, because if we're over 80% of our market is Australian compliant vehicles, they don't require Euro 6D, and they're not going to go there until at least 2025. The current timeline is 2027 because of their fuel quality issues around petrol and sulfur. So it's understanding again how the market works, the timing and the timeline to do it. So what we've suggested to them is enable WLTP, and they've done that for the 4 cycle. The 3 cycle isn't yet enabled, not within the rule structure. So every time we bring in a vehicle that's got the 3P cycle, we have to do it by exception, and keep NEDC there until we've got this timely transition. In the meantime, allow us to then convert to the WLTP 3 cycle, which would become the New Zealand standard. That's a much more doable and amendable process. So it's not a matter of that we're opposed to it. It's just the way they've gone about saying they want to do it is not possible, and that's what they don't appreciate. If they're going to bring in a policy, they have to be able to operationalise the policy, and that means they need to understand how the market works and what the tie-up is between a vehicle exhaust emissions standard and the testing protocols contained within each of those standards.
Kit, have you got a take on this? Have you seen? Do you understand why they've done what they've done, or do you believe they've got it wrong as well?
Well, the reason they've done what they've done is exactly what David Crawford said, is that it's to make sure that the data being used for the clean car standard and clean car discount is accurate and precise. And so having a single harmonized standard that everything is tested to is the best way to do that. That justification aside, the legislation as written will have less of an effect on the used industry because we are being allowed to convert for older vehicles. But then on the same token, Japan mandated WLTP in 2020. So we won't be as affected by this particular issue at all.
Mm-hmm. Now, in regards to one of the other issues that's been raised, and that's differential pricing. And Tony, I gather you guys have given us some notes around differential pricing and your thoughts on it. There may be some disagreement across the board here. For those who haven't read it, there's two categories of importers in this. There's the category 1. These are generally going to be new vehicle distributors, large fleet-based pricing, so they will have their CO2 levels measured over a year. And category 2, which will predominantly be used import operators though used import operators can be category 1 as well, who will work on a case-by-case basis. Tony, you guys have raised the issue around why those two different categories have different carbon prices on them. Can you talk to that?
Yeah, effectively the two categories are subject to a different fee structure, and there's a 25% difference in the fees. So that seems pretty considerable, certainly way beyond what you might expect if they're just trying to cover the time variance in payment as you go versus settlement at the end of the year. So it's hard to find or understand the logic behind what they're trying to do there. And there's been no disclosure as to why that's come about.
David, Vincent, you've got a take on that?
Yes, you're conflating two issues. The issue about whether you pay as you go or you have a deferred payment scheme is put aside entirely. This is very similar to the deferred payment GST scheme for importers, where they are approved to have an account, and then you put your vehicles into that account and pay for that on the due date. So for used vehicle importers, it will default to a case-by-case basis where they pay or get their incentives at the time, or they can apply to be approved for grouping their stuff for payment on an annual basis. That's one issue. The other issue that you're referring to, Richard, is the difference between new and used, the fees for new and used.
We were specifically referring to the difference between category 1 and category 2,
as
opposed to the difference between new and used, though that may be a different topic some people want to discuss. David, have you got a take on any of this?
Well, Kit's got some comment on that.
Sorry, just to make sure we're all clear what we're talking about. So you're right, you've got the category 1 and category 2 importers, and you've got your type 1 and type A and type B vehicles, which is basically passenger and light commercial. It's the penalty rationale for a category 1 importer versus the lower penalties for category 2. So even if you've got a category 1 importer, there's a differential rate already between new and used, which there is a rationale for, because the average age of a used coming in is half that of a new, so you reduce it. It's the rationale for that if you're a category 2 and you've got limited banking facility because it's no longer than at maximum as a calendar year, whereas for a category 1, there's the full banking facilities back a year and forward several years. And so the rationale that the officials have used is that because you're paying up front, you can pay lesser a fee. Now, we don't understand that. We don't think the mathematics of that is correct. The whole objective of a fuel economy standard is that you influence the vehicles that are imported, and it doesn't matter if they're imported one at a time or a group of at a time. And it doesn't matter in my mind whether you're paying at the time you import the vehicle or you've got an ability to defer and pay later. The penalty, I can't see the justification for a differential penalty. So that's where it stands. And how it has been viewed by our sector is, and whether this is correct or not, but I'll just put it on the table. Our sector feels that this is a bit of a sop to the used car sector, and we don't think it meets the standard of being fair and equitable So that is a difference of opinion, and I know that Kit will want to be able to talk about this and debate it. So it is a difference of opinion between the new and the used sectors, and we accept that there is a difference of opinion.
Kit, your take on it?
No. Sorry, I'm not actually going to argue with you, David Crawford. I agree with you that I'm not entirely certain of the rationale. I've tried to have a discussion on this particular topic with the government a few times, and I was not convinced by the arguments presented to me. Although, when you talk about the increased value of the carbon credits, that works both ways. So yes, your penalties may be bigger, but so are your credits. So it ends up averaging out to be about the same anyway. In fact, I've done modeling for the impact of the Clean Car Standard out to 2027 as proposed. And while the while the category 1, the groups that pay annually, while they end up suffering a small amount due to this in the beginning, in the end, as cars become more efficient, those bigger credits actually end up having those on the aggregate or the annual scheme benefit more than they are penalized in the first few years. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'd like to have a look at the modelling. All I'm saying is that there's a degree of uncomfortableness with our members around how that's structured.
I entirely agree. I don't understand the justification for the separate pricing, and I don't personally think that they I think if the price that they are putting on emissions as a deterrent, it's dangerous calling it a carbon price because there's no actual carbon being emitted here. If this deterrent price, I'm not quite sure why they think it would aggregate a different price for those who pay annually is deserved versus those who pay per vehicle. Other than those who pay per vehicle are likely to put the penalty or the credit on that vehicle when they sell the vehicle. Those who pay annually are likely to spread those costs across their entire fleet, in which case the higher costs for the emitting vehicles increases the prices of those higher emitting vehicles more. But I wouldn't have designed it that way, but that's been the case for most of this. So,
I guess the question too is also, will this shift people's position on whether they want to be a category 1 or a category 2? Because my understanding is it's entirely possible for a used importer to be deemed category 1. Do David or Kit, do you think many of the used import operators will be seeking that category 1 status?
There's going to be strict guidelines on who's eligible, first of all. They're going to require a certain level of provenance in the company to make sure that it will still be around at the end of the year. But beyond that, I certainly think so. And my personal recommendation would be, if you intend to sell high emitting vehicles, get on the per vehicle. And if you intend to sell low emitting vehicles, then get on the annual scheme.
Mm-hmm. Now, anyone can put their hand up for this one. I mean, is this bad? And you said it essentially in some of your communications, David, and I think you've indicated before, David. I mean, is this bad legislation? Has this been drafted badly? Has the work not been done correctly, in anyone's opinion here?
If I could start the comment on this. If you support the introduction of a fee bait, and if you support the introduction of a fuel economy standard, then the structure of the legislation and all the bits that would make those work seem to be correct in that sense. What's not correct are the variables that then determine the rate, and the variables that determine the penalties, and some of the definitions associated with light passenger versus light commercial vehicles. So it becomes poor legislation in concept. And also coming back to that ICE ban by stealth, the whole idea of a fuel economy standard is that it lowers the emissions. It's outcome focused, and you use whatever tools available for you to do that. So you actually achieve a level of an ICE ban by effect, because one of those tools is to have pure battery electric vehicles in your mix as a way of offsetting the higher emitting vehicles. And so it's premature to have the ICE ban component in it at this point in time. So it's not so much that the structure of the legislation is poor, it's the design of the tools that they're given effect to that in our view is poor.
David Vincent?
The clean car standard, I think, is unnecessary for the reasons I stated previously. And flowing from that, this whole thing has been ill-considered, poorly drafted, and we certainly don't support it.
Tony, have you got a thought on how the quality of the work that's been done here?
The mere fact I'm looking at my own analysis here with a dozen questions, and we've been poring over this bill since it was released last week, and there's a million questions. I think that answers the question that is it well designed? Possibly not, because if it was, you wouldn't have a million questions. And I'm really struggling with this. Even in one point in particular, that the application of registration of the motor vehicle must be accompanied by payment of any prescribed charges. Hold on, how does that apply? If you're a Category 1 importer and you're on a yearly thing, do you have to front with money then, or does the dealer have to front with money and reclaim it? How's that going to play out?
So, Tony, if I could just sort of interrupt here. Part of the problem is that we're just looking at a draft bill that doesn't make a lot of sense in and of itself, because it needs detailed regulations written to give effect to it. So the bill, a lot of the bill is procedural. And I recognise this from my time, a very long time as an official in the past. So it's enabling legislation. But the fact, though, that we haven't seen the shape of those regulations and the suggested amendments to the fuel consumption rule means that it's pretty difficult to understand that. We're also talking to the NZTA in a working group format to try and operationalise this. And so we're trying to provide some guidance to the NZTA, who are also, to be honest, floundering about how you address some of these questions. If you take the fee bait, I was somewhat surprised with the bill that it didn't include any primary legislation structure around the discount side of it. That is handled singularly by a cabinet decision to make it vote transport. So it's part of the budget process. So all of the rules about how the discount side of the fee bait works, who gets it, who doesn't, and the sliding scale is a vote transport budget process. The fee side of it, though, has to be by regulation, and that's where the devil is in the detail, and we haven't seen that because we haven't seen the regulation. We just know the regulation's going to have the scope to be able to do it. So it makes the statement that you picked up on. Do you, so for a new vehicle that attracts a fee, same as a used, it can't be registered until that fee is paid. So then you've got all of these series of considerations about what constructs that transaction, how does that get into a loan agreement, and then for us in the new vehicle sector it becomes even more problematic with lease vehicles, because often we don't settle the lease vehicle bill till 2 to 4 weeks after the vehicle's been supplied to the lease company, and yet they can't get it and we can't register it until all the money's been paid up front. So there are a series of practical considerations that I'm not prepared to comment too much further on until I can see the regulations, because that's where a lot of the devil in the detail is currently lying that we can't see.
Is it normal to be considering a bill like this in isolation without the regulation being ready?
There's a process order here, Richard, in that you need the primary legislation to empower the regulations to be drafted. And in fact, technically they need that bill to be passed and be enacted before they can even consult on the regulations. Because until the bill is enacted, they don't have the statutory authority to be able to consult on the regulations. And there is a whole timing issue around that I don't think they've considered properly. They want this to be in place early 2022. They've run out of time, in my view.
Can this be done? I mean, and can it be fixed as part of the legislation process? Kid, have you got a thought on that?
The only part of it that can be done is the bit that's already done, and that's the discount for BEVs and PHEVs.
And the reason for that is, of course, that the government can dish out money by way of rebates or incentives, but they can't collect additional money by way of taxes or penalties until they've got the enabling legislation. So at the moment, they're giving the discounts on the low emissions vehicles, but they're not able to collect the other side of it, which is the penalties on the higher emitting vehicles, until this legislation's passed. It is a procedural exercise, as David has said.
So my view is,
from this discussion, we've all been intimately involved in it. You can see it's horrendously complicated. It hasn't been well thought out, and I don't think we have sufficient time to meet the deadlines that they've set themselves.
Is anyone expecting the minister to admit that? I mean, is there the chance we will soon see the minister say, "Look, we admit it. This isn't going to come. This isn't going to go through in time. Push back, do whatever they need to do," or do you think that we're going to end up having this push through under urgency in a way that just perhaps is going to end up in a poor situation?
Oh, I detect the steamroller coming down the road, and they will introduce. I mean, it's already been introduced. I was surprised it actually didn't go through its first reading because it's just a series of speeches. There's no debate. I think it appears to still be in the House rather than to select committee. And so our only ability now is to make a substantive submission and try and persuade the select committee to recommend changes to the bill. Labor has a majority in the House. They have a majority on the select committee. It's going to be quite challenging if they want to be belligerent, which in a way they kind of have been in some aspects of this. Then they've got the ability to do so. So we now need to be able to persuade members of the select committee to take a decent look at this. And this is in part why I came out with our press release today to say, well, hold on a moment. You've enjoyed our support up until this stage, our contingent support, but we can't live with what you proposed. It is just too onerous. The average price of vehicles will go from 40k to 60k for a new vehicle. That's a 50% increase in the price of vehicles if nothing changes.
You've met with the minister today, I understand. Can you give us an indication of what his response was to that your statement this morning?
It never came up, and I left the powder dry for that meeting.
I understand. For Kit or David, either of you may want to comment on this. That's the position of the MIA. From VIA's perspective, while I don't know you have concerns, is it quite as damning for you guys if it does get steamrolled through this year?
We've put a lot of work into, and David, please correct me if I say something not true, but we put a lot of work into supporting the development of this to try and mitigate the risks as much as possible for our industry. I mean, we recognize it's going to be painful either way. There's no way around it. We also recognize that New Zealand's legally obligated to make changes like these, and it's just a matter of time. And so we've been putting the work in to try and shape it throughout the process and be cooperative with the understanding that our position from the beginning is that this entire policy or program is not fit for purpose for New Zealand. It is designed to influence manufacturing in a jurisdiction with manufacturing. That means the ability to supply vehicles at a set cost. And our industry has a whole layer of supply and demand that manufacturers don't have to deal with usually. And due to that, this just isn't fit for us. So I'd say there's a lot of good work that's been going on, but I think they've been given a rotten apple to bake with. I mean, they were told to take this program and make it fit instead of building something that was suitable for New Zealand from ground up. But that's...
And in fact, on that point, the government departments who are responsible for developing the detailed regulations and then implementing them are already throwing their hands up in horror, and they're using terms like brave assumptions and unrealistic timeframes. They understand that they've got a horrible mission to try to execute. But it's not just this piece of work, the clean car standard and the clean car discount, that's in play here. We're also, and David talked about a steamroller coming down the road, which is the legislative steamroller. There's a bigger one, and that's the Climate Change Commission's report, and they've got even more ambitious, or heroic, or aggressive assumptions than have been put into effect here. And so we're between a rock and a very hard place, because the government has recognised this just recently, yesterday. They are obliged by law to pass the recommendations, enact the recommendations of the Climate Change Commission by the end of this year, or come up with a policy which is better, in other words, harsher. They've now given themselves another 6 months by deferring it to May next year, because they know they can't do it. So I don't know. It's a really interesting dilemma that they have got themselves and us into.
Should they be applying that same concept to this and pushing this out to May as well?
Of course.
Yeah,
we've got two things. We've got the timeline for discussion and proper consultation, and then there's a timeline that my colleague David talks about, the timeline for implementation, which is unreasonably aggressive.
Mm-hmm. Now, David Crawford, you mentioned earlier that you'll be making a fairly substantial submission to the Select Committee. I'm sure the other organisations are doing the same. Is this a really key time for your members, across the board, to be engaging and backing that? One submission from the industry organisation is one thing, but perhaps this is one of those times when all your members or everyone in the industry should be taking note and submitting as well. Is that something you guys would encourage?
Yeah, definitely. We've already started drafting our submission in anticipation of it being to the Select Committee. So once it goes to the Select Committee, they'll decide a report back date, and then that will mean everything working back from that. We will then know how long we've got to make a submission. I'm anticipating about 6 weeks once it gets to the Select Committee for us to be able to make a submission, and it should be longer, but it's not going to be. Our members are engaged on this. When the first consultation document came out from Julianne Genter, we ran a series of industry meetings that were exceptionally well attended. Before I put out the press statement this morning, I consulted with my members on the change of position, why we were doing it, what we were hoping to achieve, and that's generated a significant amount of internal discussion. They are all in turn in very deep discussions with their parent offices around what's available, what's coming down the road in terms of technology, what can we get and buy when. And all of the vehicle manufacturers, other than those dealing principally in fully electric vehicles, are extremely worried because everybody wants these low emission vehicles. The production timeline in terms of committing the factory and getting them here and the logistics makes it very difficult. And if there's an accelerated rate that gets us ahead of production and logistics capabilities and ahead of other markets, when we don't have the clout to be able to do that. So it's kind of odd, because we have said to the government a fee-based scheme and a carefully considered fuel economy standard would significantly help us in our discussions with our parent companies to try and progressively get these sort of low emission vehicles here, and to reduce emissions and accelerate the rate at which CO2 emissions are reduced in the transport sector. So having said to them, we're keen to do this and you can help us do it, they then tied both of our hands behind our back and broke our arms in the process. That's what it feels like. And we are incredibly frustrated, and all of my members are incredibly frustrated. For a sector that actually wanted to get in behind a government initiative and try and make it work. At the moment, this is an example of how not to make it work. This is an example of how not to support an industry. We just feel very disenfranchised.
Mm-hmm. Tony, you'll be working with your dealer members to prepare something?
Yeah, absolutely. And really intrigued in the idea of an industry-wide submission. I think that'd be fantastic if we could get to that point. When we all talk as a single entity, it carries a lot more kudos. rather than chasing our own little pieces and ends out of it. But one thing I would raise, and it sort of illustrates perhaps how poorly this was thought through, or elements of it were, when the first phase of Clean Car Discount arrived in July. No one, or certainly government, had seemingly given no thought to how a dealer, if they sell an EV or a car which attracts the rebate, and that car is rejected, how that should be handled. Because if you take a pure consumer law perspective, it's quite different to perhaps what you might want as a fair outcome. And it's quite ugly. And we already know of one used import case, and we know of one new car case. So it's...
Yeah, Tony, it was a matter that was raised with the Motor Industry Association. We did have some discussions not long before this was announced around what the government thought they could do to bring in a discount ahead of a full fee-bate. And we were very keen that they should do that, and we were quite thankful that they did. But there are a few implementational issues that we suggested they need to look at, including that. But again, because it was brought in quickly and done at a cabinet budget process vote transport, they didn't get all of the mechanics in place to make it a really, really watertight process.
So if I summarize up to kind of finish here, it seems to me like generally people think the concept of reducing vehicle emissions in New Zealand is a good thing, but the way this has gone about and the detail are just not there. So look, thank you for joining me, the members of the panel. That's David Crawford from the MIA, Kit Wilkerson from VIA, David Vinsen from VIA, and Tony Everett from the MTA. Thanks again if you're watching this. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe on whatever platform you're watching this. This video will be followed up with a story in the next AutoTalk magazine, and we will keep on this Clean Car Standard issue as we go in the coming months. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Great. Thank you.